we have the technology sector here fully embraced. They'd been coming the last couple of years, but they seem fully part of the agenda, of being partners to CERAWeek and so forth. And I think that mixture of needed energy demand, energy supply for the world, power growth, AI, all these themes, I think would have been dominant. It's hard not to have this cloud of the war and the uncertainty with the strait closed hanging over this conference, I would say.
Welcome to Smarter Markets, a weekly podcast featuring the icons and entrepreneurs of technology, commodities, and finance, ranting on the inadequacies of our systems and riffing on ideas for how to solve them. Together, we examine the questions: are we facing a crisis of information or a crisis of trust? And will building smarter markets be the antidote? This episode is brought to you in part by Abax Exchange, bringing better price discovery and risk management tools to navigate today's commodities markets through centrally cleared, physically deliverable futures contracts in energy, environmental, battery materials, and precious metals markets. Smarter markets are here.
Welcome to Scenes from CERAWeek by S&P Global 2026. I'm Dave Greeley, Chief Economist at Abax Technologies. SmarterMarkets went to Houston last week for CERAWeek to partner with S&P Global. We sat down with participants at the energy industry's most influential annual conference. The theme for this year's conference was Convergence and Competition, Energy, Technology, and Geopolitics. And the implications of the conflict in Iran were on everyone's mind. We've compiled a selection of 6 of those interviews into this special episode of Smarter Markets. If you would like to listen to the full interviews, and we highly recommend that you do, they're available on our website, smartermarkets.media, on the SmarterMarkets Presents media page. They're also available on our second podcast channel, SmarterMarkets Presents, available on all major podcast platforms. Our guests in order of appearance in this episode are Arjun Murti, partner, Veriton, and publisher of Super Spiked on Substack. Susan Sakmar, adjunct professor, University of Houston Law Center, and board member, Flex LNG. Jeff Curry, chief strategy officer, Energy Pathways at Carlyle. Radhika Krishnan, chief product and technology officer, Quorum Software. Michael Greenstone, Director, the Energy Policy Institute of the University of Chicago. And David Keith, Founding Faculty Director, Climate Systems Engineering Initiative at the University of Chicago. We hope you enjoy these scenes from CERAWeek by S&P Global 2026. Smarter Markets is here at CERAWeek, where we're joined by our friend Arjun Murti, partner at Veriton and publisher of Super Spiked on Substack. Great to see you, Arjun.
Thank you, Dave. Great to be here.
So what's going on here? It's day 3 of the conference. What's been the vibe?
I think if we didn't have this really tragic war in Iran, I think the vibe would have been very positive. I think we have the technology sector here fully embraced. They'd been coming the last couple of years, but they seem fully part of the agenda, of being partners to CERAWeek and so forth. And I think that mixture of needed energy demand, energy supply for the world, power growth, AI, all these themes, I think would have been dominant. But it's hard not to have this cloud of the war and the uncertainty with the strait closed hanging over this conference, I would say.
And what's been the conversation about the war and its effects? Is it still wait and see?
I think there's been sort of 2 different groups. One group is we're not going to talk about it, and we're going to try and talk about everything else but that. And where there's been some, I think, sober talk was on the lunch panel yesterday with Richard Haas and Vali Nasser, which had a very sobering view of how that war is going in the Strait. But we've also heard from some of the leading U.S. LNG exporters, and I found them to be quite direct and also similarly sober in their view. And I think there was some really clear messaging that while LNG pricing may be up right now, there is nothing good for anyone about the strait being closed. It is bad for LNG exporters, ultimately, if it leads to economic contraction, never mind the humanitarian crisis, which is a real risk.
Right. And we're seeing that, hearing it from ammonia suppliers with fertilizer for food, LNG. You might think it's a good thing for people in the Houston area, but the economic contraction, a lot of people have been talking about how long do we have where you need a resolution? Is it measured in weeks or months before things get really serious. What are your thoughts?
I think things are already starting to get serious. When you look at multiple $100 per barrel jet fuel prices in Singapore, signs of some physical shortages in some locations, some elements of hoarding already happening in anticipation of shortages in many different Asian countries, I think it's already quite serious. I think we're very fortunate as Americans to be somewhat insulated and distanced from it, at least at the moment. But any economic contraction in Asia, which is supposed to be the global GDP engine of the world, it will spill over here. So I think we're already in the risks are rising standpoint. And all I can say is I hope it reopens and the war gets settled. If not today, then certainly tomorrow or the next day. But weeks to months is probably the good over under in terms of really spreading.
And bringing it to the title of your Substack, Super Spiked, right? Part of the super spike is what price do you need to get people to just stop using, sadly enough. And right now we've already seen oil in the Gulf well over $100 a barrel. You just said jet fuel, 200. Where do you think this could go potentially?
We revisited it in the recent issues of Super Spike, the framework we used from 20 years ago when you and I worked together. And the thing about that framework from that time frame is it was an economic expansion, it was booming GDP, and what kind of oil prices can slow GDP and oil demand growth down to the level of available supply. But it was ultimately smooth and long-term and not on one day, 20% of a lot of important things were shut off. So the price number becomes one of these very high, sort of, I'll call it infinite in the sense that you're going to have real physical shortages. And then there's no price to actually get that stuff. So you mentioned something that I want to hit upon, which is this good for Houston oil and gas companies? And I'd say this is unquestionably bad for everybody. In the short term, you might get a higher oil and natural gas price than you otherwise would, LNG price or oil price. But in the long term, that risk of really doing damage to the global economy, that's a downside risk for everybody. So this war is unquestionably bad for all of humanity.
Susan Sackmar, adjunct professor, University of Houston Law Center, and board member, Flex LNG. We've been talking about LNG for at least 4 years, and you were talking about it for many years before that, writing the book on it as well. And now it certainly seems like LNG is having another one of those moments. What's the conversation around LNG right now?
Well, you're absolutely right. It's yet another moment for LNG. And you're seeing it, I guess, front and center at CERAWeek. And of course, I'm sure I feel for the CERAWeek organizers because this event was probably planned a year ago where we were having different conversations. A year ago, the question on everyone's mind was looking like there was going to be a massively oversupplied LNG market. Where was all the LNG supply going to go?
The coming wave of 27, 28.
The coming wave, right? How was the coming wave going to be absorbed? And I would say now, no one is talking about that. So that's been sort of, the Qatar outages have completely upended that discussion. And I would say there's more discussion and more optimism in terms of, I think another wave is coming. And so you're seeing a lot of interest in yet another wave of US LNG projects that some have been in the works, some are still awaiting FIDs. I think they're all going to go. We'll get another wave because the market will need it.
And it's so fascinating because I've had the same experience here where it feels like every conversation you hear something about another LNG project in the works. Can you put that in context relative to some of the earlier waves of US LNG? How do you see the investments happening now in LNG in the US in these new projects?
Well, I think now with someone noted on stage that we've had 2 wars in 5 years. So we're in a different world. And I think there's still a lot of uncertainty as to what this new world is going to look like. But, some things are already coming out, which is globalization seems to be under stress. So, the era of deglobalization may be upon us. What does that mean in terms of trade, in terms of allies? But the 2 wars in 5 years has really put LNG and energy security to the forefront. And what a lot of people, oil obviously is important, but LNG has become almost, equally important because you need LNG for a lot of well, we're seeing it. You need it not just for power, but now we're seeing fertilizer implications, helium, right? So we're seeing all these other products that most people didn't maybe realize were sort of derivative of natural gas. So we're seeing that now in the market, and that's a bit different. And so you're just seeing just continued interest in LNG and, yeah, another wave of projects. So I think we're going to start to see even more FIDs sooner if people can ramp up.
Jeff Curry, Chief Strategy Officer, Energy Pathways at Carlyle. It's a good time to talk because it's a bad situation in the world. We have the conflict in Iran, obviously first and foremost in many people's minds in the energy markets. Can you put this into context? What's happening now?
Well, it's definitely one of the largest shocks. In fact, it is the largest shock the oil markets have ever seen in their history. And just to quote Fatih Birol, who put it as the combination of 73 and 79 put together, which I think is an appropriate assessment. But let's think about it and put it in the context of COVID. COVID, I would argue, is more appropriate analogy. That was a 20 million barrel per day demand collapse. Here, it's a 20 million barrel per day supply collapse. Now, let's think about what it took to rebalance the market during COVID. So you had supply up here and demand there, right? And then demand came down here. Once you filled up all the storage tanks, meaning that you were lending barrels to the future and you couldn't lend anymore, what happened? Boom, you had to crush demand down in line with, or supply down in line with demand. Let's recall, what kind of prices did that take? Minus $37 a barrel to do it. So now we're doing the reverse, where you have supply down here, demand is up here. Eventually, once we exhaust our ability to draw down inventories, which we think is somewhere mid to late April, what has to happen? Demand has to come crashing down in line with supply. And the key question you have to ask is, how high do you have to go? Because I think, we put a piece out, you can't print molecules. There's nothing you can do. Once you've exhausted the inventories at that gap, you have to force that alignment. And I think that's the key question.
And you say we have maybe till mid to late April. And even as much as energy prices have gone up, they haven't gone up to that extent. And so it reminds me of that old Hemingway quote, I think, of like, how do you go bankrupt? Slowly, then all at once.
Yep.
Like, are we in a slowly, then all at once scenario? And how do you frame this? How are you putting a framework around what's going to happen next?
Yeah, I think what we've priced in is, the old saying, buy the rumor, sell the fact. Well, we've priced in the rumor. And that's how we got up to where, $95, $100 a barrel in WTI and Brent right now. I think most people think the highs were behind us and that you sell the fact when you get the piece. No, that's not how commodity markets work. Commodity markets are not anticipatory assets. They're spot assets. I think, Dave, you invented that terminology at Goldman way back when. And so they don't price the future, they price the now. And the supply and demand the price has to clear supply and demand today. We're not in a shortage today. We're going to be a shortage mid-April. That's when the market has to clear. And so if anyone, I think, buy the rumor and really buy the fact here, because that's when it's going to become quite explosive, is when you have to actually clear the market. And when I think about the framework, think about you have this buffer between when the disruption happened and when you run out of inventories. The beginning, let's just use the big oil glut, the biggest numbers. Let's say 800 million to 1 billion barrels of oil that was built up. That's about as much as you could realistically say. We put it around 800. You take the disruption. This month, you're going to lose somewhere even with the SPR, you're going to lose 440 to 450 million barrels. That's almost half of it right there, a little more than half of it. So by the time you move into April, it won't take long before you've exhausted and you're at tank bottoms. Watch out the SPRs. There's not a lot of left. Integrity of the caves, the caverns will be stressed. So by the time we get to the middle or the end of April, we start to have a real serious problem. And I think that's when you can potentially see prices really begin to spike.
And people who don't stay as close to the energy markets as you do may not have noticed yet, just by looking at the TI price or the Brent price, the stresses that are already in the system. You see $200 jet fuel in Asia, regional crudes well over 100. Where are you starting to see some of the stress form?
I think you pinpoint it. It's in Asia because it's the closest transportation to that. And when you think about what's going on diesel, like down in Australia, to the point they're having to shut mines down, the shortages. Why? Because they took a lot of the diesel out of the China market, and China has export controls on it. So you've already impacted that world. You have Thailand export controls. This is hoarding. That's the big question. And it's impacting the Philippines already. So that part of the world, you're already seeing it. In the spreads between the financial and physicals are record levels. And I think that really, pinpoints, ABEX is in a really unique position to be able to take advantage of these differentials that are at record levels. And so when we look at what's likely to happen is those differentials that are sitting in Asia right now. Now let's do the transportation time to Rotterdam. About 4 weeks. When does 4 weeks come? Probably about next week. And that's when you can probably see prices trading substantially. Oman Brent, they hit like 191, or Oman in Dubai, they spiked to $191 a barrel last week. Yeah, they've collapsed into that 120 range as something, with the contract integrity. Also, I do believe if you take the average, they're trading around 20 plus dated Brent, which puts it in that 125 range. So prices are much higher there. Now, I would argue the molecular contagion spreads to Europe sometime in the next week or two. Now, the last place a little bit is, we're here in Texas right now. It'll be the last place that it hits.
And in addition to regional contagion, this is also much more than the oil market, right? We've got the natural gas market through the LNG shut-ins. In Qatar, we've got ammonia shortages. Like, how widespread is this across the whole complex?
By the way, it's 8% of global trade. And let's not forget about what goes in. I mean, everybody's focused on what comes out, but you need the bauxite to go in, to go to like the Alba smelters to produce the aluminium that gets sent back out, so that the implications are widespread. So it's hitting the base complex, the food complex, the energies, plastics, the list goes on. And I think a key point here is, I like to say, no good deed goes unpunished. All of those efficiency gains we've made over the last 50 years really begin to create a critical use of oil demand. So when you pull that barrel out of the global economy, it's going to have a much larger impact on growth.
Radhika Krishnan, Chief Product and Technology Officer, Quorum Software.
We definitely feel like we're at an inflection point, whether as it pertains to the energy industry and everything that's going on, as well as what's going on with the technology space at large, with the introduction of AI and the fact that it's become so central to everything that goes on in the energy space. So for us coming in, a lot of this has been about, not so much about the structured sessions as much as the conversations we get to have with our customers, with our partners, the learning that happens, and really sort of getting more tuned into the problems and the opportunities and the challenges that are ahead for the energy industry at large.
And walking the halls here, you can't help but notice so many technology companies here this year: Microsoft, Google, NVIDIA. Quorum's been providing technology to the energy sector for a long time. And one of the themes of the conference this year is convergence and competition. And I was wondering, how are you viewing so many of these other technology companies? Is there a collaboration or a competition?
Yeah, no, definitely. As is typical in these situations, we tend to call it co-opetition, where, there is definitely convergence, but then there is also the shifting dynamics of where various providers are looking to deliver value. And so we're definitely witnessing that. What is becoming pretty evident is, in order to take advantage of some of the capabilities that AI provides, you really need to ensure that you have a robust data foundation underneath. Like historically, where the energy industry has always struggled and where there have been challenges around operational efficiency and maybe even, decisions around capital allocation and so forth, is the fact that a lot of the work has to happen manually, right? And so, there is all these islands of data that fit behind each of the specific workflows or the use cases. And so you really require a lot of humans to reconcile the data between these systems and make sure that the appropriate action gets taken. And so we're at these crossroads where we could technically, the good news is there is lots of data. There's gobs of data everywhere: production data, accounting data, finance data, and so forth. So there is a real opportunity to sort of step in and figure out how you reconcile all of these data islands and then leverage that to not just introduce operational efficiency where you can automate more of the workflows, but more importantly, to shorten the cycle, right? Like historically, what's taken months or quarters could now get shortened to potentially days and hours, which significantly improves the ability to detect anomalies, fix them, and as well as really sort of think of it as the way that you recoup your investments. That cycle has now become significantly shorter.
And for people who aren't familiar with how information technology is used in the energy industry, could you give us a little background of what companies come to you for?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So there's a lot that happens in the energy context across upstream and midstream and downstream as well. And so on the upstream side, a lot of this tends to be around making decisions both at a corporate level as well as at an asset level. So you could be a company on the throes of evaluating a M&A, right? You're looking to acquire certain assets. How do you make decisions around that? Ranging from that all the way to, if you get into E&P, exploration and production, like how do you think about the assets that you have? How do you make determinations around how you deploy your capital? It gets into, more of the operational elements of it as well, right? How do you think about, especially here in the US, how do you think about land assets and leases and managing through those? How do you think about accounting? Production accounting can actually be a very complicated sphere. And then going all the way into like well operations, coming up with like type curve and decline curve and making determination of where you want to drill and how you want to invest, so on and so forth. So on the upstream side, and then on the midstream side, we definitely have offerings that focus on measurement where, you actually have the ability to accurately measure, as well as in the management of pipelines, which interestingly is becoming a very critical central topic as we get into data center and delivering power and things of that nature.
And where do you see as the biggest area where AI could be helpful to the energy industry?
Honestly, at this point, if you can corral the data, it does feel like AI can be literally game changing. We're seeing significant opportunity as well as interest from our customers is the ability to correlate various workflows and functions and personas and use cases to where you can streamline, for instance, how a CFO's office could actually do capital allocation, or whether that's like providing recommendations to the board for how to like think about the dividends, for instance, or emissions reporting or things of that nature, all the way down to how you could streamline day-to-day operations and make it significantly friction-free to where you're actually able to much more categorically assess ROI, which historically has always been an elusive thing. Now AI actually gives you tooling that allows you to be able to quantify a variety of things, right? Now, the most interesting thing by far, Dave, I would say is this notion of agentic workflows that have come into the picture, where you could introduce a significant level of autonomy in the way that operations happen. And you could make a determination of whether you want a human in the loop intervening and overriding things. But for the most part, workflows that lend itself to those kinds of autonomous decisions and use cases actually benefit very significantly from AI.
Michael Greenstone, Director, the Energy Policy Institute of the University of Chicago.
One thing I've been struck by is if you compare it to a couple years ago, climate was on the tip of everyone's tongue. And I don't think actually most people recognize that word anymore. I think it's in some distant part of their brain, like, oh yeah, I've heard of that. So I like to think of it, what the world is trying to do is balance between the need for economic growth, which depends on low energy prices, and the risks from climate change, and find the right balance. And like, we've now shifted all the way over to just low energy prices.
So what do you think shifts us back?
Well, the nasty thing about carbon dioxide is it goes up in the atmosphere and it stays up there a really, really long time, like a couple centuries. So climate change isn't going away, and it will rear its ugly head in various ways. And I think that will drive it back.
Reality will interject.
Yeah. And, if political systems matter as well, and if we want to spend a few years just ignoring that word, that can probably be effective for a few years, but it can't be effective forever.
Well, I did notice up here at the Nexus, there's a number of colleges and universities represented, including your own. What's the next generation? I think they even talk about that. They are getting the next generation into energy and into climate. How is that progressing?
So, well, we've started the Chicago Curriculum on Climate and Growth. That we started that because when we kind of did an analysis of what other universities are doing, there's one that have like a pure sustainability thing, like the slight exaggeration that are kind of almost like climate is a moral issue and we should unstate it, devote all resources to it. And then you have other universities very focused on energy supply and the cost of energy, and they tend to be engineering focused and not a lot of focus on climate. And I just found that super surprising. Here's such an obvious case where there's trade-offs between the two goals. Both goals are legitimate. And so we devised the Chicago Curriculum on Climate and Growth to provide students with a kind of 360-degree perspective on the problem and with the trade-offs really at the center of it. So anyway, there's now a major that starts in Chicago this fall. There's the first master's program that's launching joint with the policy school this summer. And as part of that, we brought some students here to CERAWeek, and they have been getting a ton out of it. They report.
That's fantastic. It's great to see that. And in terms of the research agenda as well, University of Chicago, of course, well known for its strong research. Where do you think we need to be seeing more research to get that balance between the economy and the climate?
Yeah, so I think, look, every economist wakes up, looks in the mirror in the morning and thinks, you know what? Not only should we have a carbon tax, we're probably just about to have one, and maybe even a global one, as long as it's early in the morning before there's a lot of coffee. I think certainly a global one is off the table. One in the U.S. is off the table for a long period of time. We do have carbon pricing in some parts of the world, but I think probably the most important thing that I think we could be doing is just shooting money at innovation and trying to turn over the cards and hope we get lucky with some technologies that are inexpensive, low carbon technologies that are inexpensive. Because I don't think we're going to have a level playing field where the fossil fuels have to compete, recognizing their full cost against the other technologies.
And one can't help but notice here the presence of the big tech companies, got Microsoft, Google, NVIDIA, really having a larger footprint in the energy industry than they have in the past with their own tremendous need for power for their data centers. What do you think the role could be for the big tech companies in what you're looking at?
So I think some of those tech companies have the benefit of, let's call them extra normal or market power based profits. That could give some of them the luxury of not choosing power just on the private cost, just on the cost. And I think some might be tempted. They all kind of posture that they're going to be very tempted, but some might be tempted to actually spend a little bit more for the low carbon energy sources. So that's one thing they could do. That might help those sources move down the learning curve. You've seen some of these agreements on nuclear. I think that's motivating some of that. But at the end of the day, I think like depending on the kindness of strangers is not usually a very successful strategy. And it's unfair to put it on one company or two or even five companies' shoulders. Like the rules of the road have to be set by policy, and the policy has to be set by governments.
And one of the themes this year at the conference is competition and convergence. I know part of your founding of EPIC was to try to bring the benefits of what's done well in academia into the practical applications that we need in the world. What do you think the role for collaboration between our universities and our energy industry could be or should be?
So I think there's an obvious one on development of new technologies. That's absolutely true. I think there are certainly getting the companies to lend some insight into the Chicago Curriculum on Climate and Growth and what are the skills and the viewpoints that they feel like their current employees don't have. That's another one. And so I think there's a lot of opportunities.
And just thinking about, before I let you go, in terms of that pendulum that swings back and forth, if you were back here in a year, where would you like to have seen that pendulum move a little bit?
I think I'd like to see it move a little bit back to, I don't think we should be all climate all the time, and I don't think we should be all low energy prices all the time. What we should be trying to do is to, in econ speak, maximize human well-being. Like allow people to lead their fullest lives possible. And that requires balancing between these two goals and not unitarily focusing on one.
Jeff Curry, Chief Strategy Officer, Energy Pathways at Carlyle. And so, even if we avoid the terrible scenario of this not resolving and these major shortages hitting sometime in April, it's still not a great picture if you're an energy consumer. So I wanted to ask you, how are you thinking about where do we go from here under both scenarios?
I think no matter what, you have done permanent damage to global supply chains. I mean, everything. The boats are in the wrong places. They've dumped cargoes in other parts of the world. In fact, Costco this morning in China is going to dump stuff on land, try to truck it across. It's going to take months to get ships back into the right places. So I'd say those are some of the real permanent shifts. And I think lastly, bringing it to the new dual order, where we argued security is paramount, and that when we think about investment in energy, you've got to go back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which is fear, greed, and compassion. And if you get the rank ordering on those wrong, you end up with bad outcomes. You look at Germany, it put compassion above fear and greed, and it got caught short on everything. And by the way, it learned its lesson. If there's one group, in fact, they just turned a Volkswagen auto factory into a missile factory. So they're retooling themselves fast. But why is this important? Maslow said, build a secure base. And that's what I think security is the most important. So the lasting effect of this is going to be to focus on creating a secure energy source. And I like to point out that France has the lowest carbon footprint in the world. It didn't get there because it wanted to save the planet. It got there because it wanted energy security. Charles de Gaulle, his biggest fear is exactly what's happening right now. So he built all those nuclear power plants to be able to create that security. And renewables and energy transition were born out of the energy crisis in 1973. They were not born out of the Paris Agreement in 2015 at all. They were created out of that. And so if anything, what we're going to see is we're going to turbocharge the energy transition. And you go to those emerging markets, they're going to go, hey, well, let's put a gas turbine up, some solar, some wind, maybe a nuclear reactor, and we're going to drive EVs. And I think that's a serious risk.
Susan Sackmar, Adjunct Professor, University of Houston Law Center, and Board Member, Flex LNG. When you look around, right, so we have this closure of the Straits of Hormuz, at least a selective closure. We've got the Qatari LNG offline, facilities damaged. Putting to one side how it plays out in the near term, how do you think that changes where people will be investing and where LNG will be coming from in the future?
Well, again, I think the U.S. is emerging as the place to be. One, for reliable. I mean, that's come up a number of times. Reliability. And now Qatar, to its credit, Qatar was a reliable supplier and was the sort of the gold standard for many, many years. And so I think that's taken people by surprise and has been a bit of a shock to the industry, like an unfortunate shock. Most people thought very highly of the Qataris and what Qatar LNG had built out with, by the way, their major IOC partners. Exxon was there, Conoco, Phillips, Shell, right? So there were partners, big players that were partners with them. So I think that's been unfortunate, but it's also made people think, what regions of the world are safe? And there aren't that many, unfortunately, right? I mean, the Middle East now doesn't look safe. There's a war still in Ukraine and Europe, which doesn't look to be ending. In fact, everybody's been a bit distracted now by the Iranian war. So what's going on in that Ukraine war, which a few weeks ago, maybe there was going to be a peace deal. Now, I think it's only intensified. So that's another region battling a war. Latin America has challenges. Asia doesn't really have the resources. So it's a combination of energy security is becoming a combination. Who has resources? The U.S. and North America, Canada, our friendly neighbors to the north, have a lot of resources. Alaska has a lot of resources. And then, knock on wood, hopefully we remain a safe region. I mean, We look safer than most, I suppose, at the moment. So I think a lot of investors are looking at the US even more closely than before.
We're just getting started, huh?
We're just getting started. I mean, I guess we're only in 10 years, and it seems like it took a long time, but we're only getting started. We have another 30 years of 30, 40 years, maybe 50 years. I mean, these are 40-year projects. Like Cheniere has said that. The folks at Cheniere have said, when you build an LNG facility, it's a 30-plus year asset, and they're hoping to get 50 years out of it, right? So they're going to get as many years out of it as they can.
Well, we'll have a lot to talk about for a long time to come. David Keith, founding faculty director, Climate Systems Engineering Initiative at the University of Chicago. And I wanted to ask you about the work you're doing at the University of Chicago, because there's two aspects, right? It's like known for the research and then also for the educating the undergraduates and the next generation of students. Maybe starting with the research, what do you think are the most important areas for us to develop a better understanding right now when it comes to climate?
Well, that's a super big question. I'm focused on climate engineering on really these two topics, sunlight reflection and open system carbon removal. And I'd say, while I'm a professor, I've spent a lot of time doing practical kind of blue collar work. And I think my focus is to try and use the kind of intellectual high end part of U Chicago and help it do more practical applied work on these topics.
And for people who aren't familiar, could you tell us a little bit about what climate systems engineering is?
Yeah, it's a new U Chicago idea. I was hired in to kind of make that idea real, but it combines probably two big things. One is what we call sunlight reflection, the idea that humans could deliberately make the Earth a bit more reflective or preserve the reflectivity of the Earth by engineering interventions, which would reduce climate change. And the second is open systems carbon removal, ways to remove carbon from the atmosphere. And then we also work a little bit on glacial engineering. Those are the kind of big topics. And then we do this in an interdisciplinary way.
And when you look at the students, how do you train them to do the blue collar type work that's required?
Good question. Give them opportunities. I think people actually realize that. That is, I think there are people coming into university who understand that there's a certain kind of academic publication loop, especially around certain sort of academic work on energy and climate, that's not that coupled to the practical world. And students often come into it actually wanting to have some practical input. So I think you need to give them opportunities. I think they already want it.
For a long time, the oil and gas industry obviously has a lot of engineering talent, a lot of people who are used to systems thinking. Do you see some of that moving into the climate space, ability to access?
For sure. I mean, Oxy's purchase of carbon engineering was one example of that. So I started that company in 2009. It was just the original investment was $3 million. It was a few people. We went through a bunch of rounds. By the time Oxy bought us, we were about 150 people. And we had a lot. But we did not and never thought we would have the capacity to actually execute a $1 billion build. And Oxy and the big EPC firms do. And that's fantastic. So we're thrilled that they're doing it.
I know conferences aren't necessarily your thing, but if you could think about how the conversation at a conference like this might evolve over the next year, what would be a way you would like to see it evolve?
Next year, the focus is going to be totally on the energy shock from the war, I think. The big question is, to me, is how that energy shock interacts with the gradual build out of solar. And I think the thing that people, I think, still underappreciate is how solar getting cheaper and cheaper will change big energy markets. Because I'm a proud Canadian. I live in Camrose, Alberta. Canadians like to talk a lot about this, but the reality is that solar is much cheaper in sunny places close to the equator, and particularly in places where where you only have a diurnal cycle, but not a big seasonal cycle, because that's where storage is relatively cheap. So if you ask where the cheapest power in the world is going to be, it's going to be in sites like that. And that's quite profound. It really shifts the energy balance and the economic balance. And I think it'll shift the security balance in the long run.
Arjun Murti, partner, Veriton, and publisher of Super Spiked on Substack. And in an industry that's changing so quickly, and the technology with AI is changing so rapidly, what do you think makes the management team today successful? What characteristics would you look for in a management team to say, oh, these folks, they're going to be able to do it?
I actually love that question. I'm going to tie it into sort of some macro scenario analysis discussions that I've been part of, where if you followed sort of the mainstream views of here's the outlook, I don't know that it would lead you in a very good direction as a company, and it would often lead to some sort of mark-to-market type analysis. So the emphasis 5 years ago would have been on net zero and those types of pathways. In a previous period, might have been unbridled oil demand growth. And I think the best companies have always listened to the range of views, call in experts with different opinions, but they've ultimately blazed their own trail. I think back to Canadian Natural Resources back in the late 90s, buying Western oil sands assets from Amoco at a time everyone knew oil prices were going to be $10 forever or some low number. It's been a home run deal for them. I think of these LNG exporters I just mentioned of saying, hey, the world's going to need our LNG, whether you realize it or not. And we think Henry Hub stays low and we can get the shipping costs low. And I think these management teams that can take all the information in, but ultimately blaze their own unique trail is what we're really trying to find.
And as we all move down the trail into the future, I'm curious, you think ahead to next year, hopefully we won't still be talking about the war and we won't be talking about a global recession or anything like that. But what would you like to see the industry do to try to take some good steps forward?
I'm actually appreciative of the opportunity to engage with some of these leading technology and industrial companies. So at the firm I'm involved with, Veriton, we've got a range of sort of customers who, what I'm observing from like these users of energy, technology, industrials, is they actually want to understand the full energy value chain. They kind of have an immediate need for power, but they're not limiting themselves to just understanding power. And I think it's actually very insightful on their part. We have to understand what's going on in oil, even if we're not an oil producer or it's going to directly impact power procurement as an example. I think the holistic view they're taking, it's actually pretty impressive to see. I think actually energy companies might benefit from learning something about that, to understand what is going on with renewables and storage. If you're an oil sands producer, which may not notionally directly impact you, to understand trends in electrification, where it's happening, where it's not happening. We don't know the path going forward. Every time you have one of these crises, something unexpected comes out of it. No one would have thought BRICS expansion would have led to the Permian Basin a decade later being the winning play. No one would have thought shale gas being discovered would have led to an LNG export boom kind of 15 years or 10 or 15 years later. Those are just two examples.
I want to ask you one more question because it's so interesting with the technology companies. For years, they might come to a conference like this because it was about supplying technology to the energy industry. Now, of course, they're going to be massive consumers of energy with the AI data centers. And as you said, moving through the supply chain, trying to understand it. How transformative do you think the technology companies, their presence will be, and how deep into the energy industry do you think they'll incorporate themselves?
I think the tech sector's involvement with energy is the best thing to happen to the energy sector because there are people who know how to talk in normal human language to the broader world. And one of the challenges with energy, and I know you appreciate this, Dave, is good energy policy is decade-long in nature. It's not, I won an election and I'm going to undo what the previous person said, and then 4 years later, they're going to do what I said, which is some of the challenges we face in this country. You've had a different set of challenges in Europe, which they've had some deindustrialization, which at least can in part be linked back to some of their energy policies. And so I think what I appreciate about the technology companies, I think they have a chance to be positive advocates for sensible energy policy going forward that at its core says it has to be available and reliable 24/7. It ideally has to be affordable almost all of the time, but that we're also not going to pretend environmental and other considerations don't exist. I say you have to get that ordering right. I think you also need to be able to explain to at least the American public in our case, but to the global world of how to think through these things. The nature of technology companies is long-term in orientation. It's disruptive in orientation. They've also generated very good returns on capital and free cash flow, which is something I appreciate. And so they also talk like normal human beings to the broader world. And I think they have a chance to be heard in a way that's sometimes engineering-oriented, very smart, but engineering-oriented introverts in the oil and gas sector especially don't always get heard.
Thanks again to all of our guests and to S&P Global for inviting us to CERAWeek 2026. We hope you enjoyed the episode. If you would like to listen to the full interviews, they're available on our website, smartermarkets.media, on the SmarterMarkets Presents media page. They're also available on our second podcast channel, SmarterMarkets Presents, available on all major podcast platforms. We'll be back next week with a return to our podcast series, Weathering Decarbonization. We hope you'll join us.
This episode is brought to you in part by Abax Exchange, bringing better price discovery and risk management tools to navigate today's commodities markets through centrally cleared, physically deliverable futures contracts in energy, environmental, battery materials, and precious metals markets. Smarter Markets are here. Contact sales at abax.exchange to get started. That concludes this week's episode of Smarter Markets by Abax. For episode transcripts and additional episode information, including research, editorial, and video content, please visit smartermarkets.media. Please help more people discover the podcast by leaving a review on Apple Podcast, Spotify, YouTube, or your favorite podcast platform. Smarter Markets is presented for informational and entertainment purposes only. The information presented on Smarter Markets should not be construed as investment advice. Always consult a licensed investment professional before making investment decisions. The views and opinions expressed on Smarter Markets are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect those of the show's hosts or producer. Smarter Markets, its hosts, guests, employees, and producer, Abax Technologies, shall not be held liable for losses resulting from investment decisions based on informational viewpoints presented on Smarter Markets. Thank you for listening, and please join us again next week.